and it's a great honor for me to interview you. So, Honorable Attorney General Wasden, you received the People First Award from the Idaho Newspaper Foundation in 2007 for your work to create transparent government. And you're actually one of the first to start a current podcast, one out of two, and the Council for the State. And so what inspired you to start a podcast in the first place? Because it's a great idea, I think. And I listened to several episodes, and they were very interactive, and I learned a lot. So what inspired you to start a podcast in the first place?
Well, first of all, I have really good staff, Scott Graff and Brian Kane, who raised that idea. I've spent a long time trying to educate people about what the Attorney General actually does. I ask that question often out there, and most people just have a blank look on their face. Some of them actually believe I'm a cheerleader for one policy view or another, which is not what the role of the Attorney General is. And so we felt like it would be a good opportunity for us in a podcast to try and educate people about the legal issues that exist and what the role of the Attorney General is in state government, and how. And it is very confusing to people. It's not really that hard, but they've not really thought their way through it.
Right. And so when you started this podcast, how was the response from the Idaho citizens, and how has it, stayed the same or changed during the pandemic?
Well, I think the response was pretty good. I can't say that we're the most popular television program on the internet, but I think that people who've taken the time to view those podcasts have learned some things. We also invite other state officers in, and they're able to use that forum to explain what they're doing, why they're doing it, and so it proves to be a very good tool. During the pandemic, it has been a good tool because we started it before the pandemic. We've just flowed through the pandemic, and where things went much more online rather than in person is sort of played right into the role of the podcast that we were doing.
Yeah, that's very great. You're trying to educate what the Attorney General does to Idaho citizens. So you are the longest serving Attorney General in state's history. And can you tell us what inspired you to become an Attorney General in the first place?
When I was about 3 or 4, I was watching Perry Mason with my mother. You're too young to know who Perry Mason was, but some of us are old enough to know who Perry Mason was. And it was a lawyer show on television. And it's not realistic, it's more Hollywood. But I watched that, and I decided when I was 3 or 4 that I wanted to be a lawyer. And that wasn't what my family history was. My father was a pharmacist and a businessman. But I decided I wanted to go to law school. And my interest naturally was in the area of politics. I was in Young Republicans in high school and all of those kinds of things. And the opportunity arose after I completed law school, and I'd been working for a number of years. The opportunity arose to be the Attorney General, and that was just a natural collection of my interests, both of politics and of the law. And as a consequence, I was able to run and was elected.
That's a very inspiring story. And so you've served many long, great years. And what have been some ups and downs throughout your journey to get to be an Attorney General, and when you were an Attorney General?
Yeah, that's a great question because there's lots of ups and downs. Some of the things that have happened early on. When I was first elected, there was brought criminal charges against the sitting mayor and his chief of staff and his human resource director. We did that as a special prosecution out of the city of Boise. These were people that I actually knew, but starting off that way, some people were very angry. How dare you file criminal charges against my mayor? And he was my son's soccer coach or whatever else. But the issue was, did they break the law? It wasn't, some personal animosity or personal vendetta or anything of that nature. It was simply, what are the facts? What's the law? What's the outcome? And that sort of set the tone for all my years in office. And that is, I call balls and strikes fairly and squarely.
Right.
It's not influenced by politics, it's not influenced by religion, it's not influenced by social standing. We call balls and strikes fairly and squarely. If they're in the strike zone, it's a strike.
Right.
If it's not in the strike zone, it's a ball.
Right.
Just plain and simple. And so that's sort of the way in which I've approached this job. And what that does is it creates stability and predictability. People know that, yeah, that's how he's going to call it.
Right.
And so that's why I've approached this office the way that I have.
Right. And maybe like one of your best moments as Attorney General?
One of my best moments, I will tell you that it's a project that we have worked on a lot. It's the Internet Crimes Against Children. And we had a couple of instances. I went around the state and I made many presentations. I don't know how many, a couple of hundred, trying to educate parents and youth about the dangers that are on the internet. The internet is a fantastic tool, but it has some limitations and has some risks and dangers. And in that course of that discussions, there on more than one occasion, we were able to intercept or intercede and save the life of a child. That is a truly rewarding experience. When you make a real difference in someone's life. On one occasion, there was a young girl in North Idaho that while I was talking to them, she got up and went and talked to a school resource officer because there was a man from Texas who at that moment was driving to Idaho to meet her.
Wow.
And so we were able to involve her parents, involve the local police department, and actually save the life of that child. That isn't the only one of those. I've had several of those that have happened. Those are tremendously rewarding experiences because you really do make a difference in someone's life.
Yeah, that's truly amazing. And what can we, the people, do to help the Attorney General's office?
Probably the greatest thing that people can do is actually understand what the Attorney General does. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a long answer, but I think it's necessary. And that there's a distinction between policy and the law. And not everybody understands that. In fact, a lot of legislators don't even understand that. What I mean when I say policy and the law is that policy is what we think the law should be or what we think the law should do. But the law is what the law actually is. Sometimes those are the same things. Oftentimes they are not. So let me give you an example of that.
What is one of the toughest decisions you've made as Attorney General, and how did you navigate that challenge?
The hardest, most difficult days I have had as Attorney General, I've had some difficult days, very difficult days, but was convicted murderers, and they were sentenced to death. And this isn't a fun topic, but I have a specific statutory obligation in that process. It's very hard. I mean, when you face that, what you're doing is that you are participating in the taking of a human life. And those are dark and difficult days. They are emotionally draining, but it's also the exercise of the rule of law. This is a person who's committed a heinous crime. They have been convicted of that crime. They have run the gamut of their appeals, and they have been sentenced by a court under the law to death. And that is probably the most difficult thing I have done professionally.
Yeah. And when working with big companies, I think you talked about Apple, how do you make sure not to jeopardize some of the benefits we gain from those companies as well, like Apple providing jobs or being grounds for innovations?
Yeah. Well, I guess the best story I can tell you is this. There's a very big company here in Idaho, and they produce microchips. And they're one of a handful of countries or companies around the world who do that. And they were participants in an illegal price fixing scheme, which that's a violation of law. And they went to the U.S. Department of Justice and said, hey, we've been involved in this illegal price fixing scheme. And under federal provisions, the first company that reports this to the Department of Justice gets immunity. All the other companies were then prosecuted and convicted and paid $750 million in fines for their illegal activity. We then brought an action, civil action, to recoup the money from overpayment, meaning that every time the state bought a computer, it paid more than it should have because of this illegal price fixing scheme. We shouldn't have had to pay that, so we were going to recoup that money. A lot of people were really angry with me, saying, hey, why are you suing the largest private employer in the state? And the answer is, it doesn't matter whether they're the largest private employer or they're the mom and pop grocery store on the street corner. They have to live by the law. It's the issue you raised earlier, the rule of law, and that is we all have to live by it. Right. So it isn't a function of undermining jobs or anything like that. It is, did they violate the law? What are the facts? What's the law? That determines the outcome. Right. That's the question, how do I make sure that I don't undermine the benefits that corporations have? I mean, corporations are what have made America great. I mean, in terms of providing jobs and innovation and products and serving people. It's stunning, okay? Right. Strongest economy ever known in the history of mankind. Right. But we all have to play by a set of rules. Right. And I'm playing, in that sense, the traffic cop, okay? Right. Saying, okay, in the marketplace, you can't lie to people. Right. You have to be honest. You can't deceive people about what your product is or what it will do, because that undermines the market. And it undermines the benefit that we would otherwise have. You grab $1 today, but you really mess things up in the future. So my job is to really be the traffic cop in that scenario and say, no, you're not living by the rules. Right. Okay, got to live by the rules. And by doing that appropriately, it actually enhances the benefits that we get from that corporate world. Right.
And kind of a follow-up question, you talked about the Microchip company. Did they come and confess? Or did they get caught?
No, they were very upset with me. Oh. They were very upset with me. They and recognize they confessed to the federal government. Right. So there was the criminal stuff, but there's also another aspect, and that's the civil aspect. Right. And that is, as I mentioned, so that for a period of 5 years, every time the state bought a computer, it paid more for that computer than it should have. Right. So if you have someone who robs a bank, they don't get to keep the money. Right. And that's what was happening, is that they essentially had illegally taken money, and so what my lawsuit was saying is, you got to give the money back. Right. Okay? The criminal stuff is handled, but you can't keep the money that you took from people improperly. Right. And they were very upset with me about that, and they sent a lot of political figures to me to convince me not to go forward. They had said things like, well, you're just trying to make a name for yourself. Right. Now, this happened during an election year, so I pose to you this question. What's the political upside for me to file a lawsuit against the major employer in the state in an election year?
Not much. Not much, yeah.
So the question isn't, am I trying to make a name for myself? The question is, am I willing to do what the law requires of me, even when it's to my political disadvantage? Right. I will tell you that happened to be an election year. My wife is my campaign manager. She was very upset with me. And I said to her, don't you want me to do what's right? And she said, I'm trying to get you elected. You do what's right next year. I said, no, I'm going to do what's right this year. So I say that in total jest. My wife was fully supportive. Right. But that's the point. Concerning the rule of law, am I willing to live by the rule of law even when it's to my disadvantage?
Yes.
The answer for me is yes, I am.
That's truly inspirational. Do you receive pressure, from obviously government and your pressure as well, and how do you handle that?
Well, I guess the case that I can talk about the greatest was occurred last December, and that was there were a number of my colleagues, one in particular who filed an original action in the United States Supreme Court challenging the validity of the November election. A number of my colleagues joined in an amicus effort in support of that, and I chose not to. And I will explain to you why I chose not to. But in that process, I received, I don't know how many thousands of emails, phone calls, many of them vicious, many of them vulgar, claiming all kinds of bad stuff. Okay, I mean, when I say thousands, it crashed our phone system here. So to answer your question, do you receive political pressure? Do I receive political pressure? And the answer is yes. Okay.
Right.
So the second half of your question is, how do I deal with it? So here's the question. That is, what are the facts and what is the law? And as long as I stay on what are the facts and what is the law, then I can withstand the political pressure.
Right.
One thing that Abraham Lincoln, one of my heroes, said was to stand in the right, to put your feet in the right place and then stand firm. The key is to put your feet in the right place. So if your feet are in the right place, you can withstand all of that political pressure. So let me tell you why I chose not to join that lawsuit. And here's the reason why. A lot of people misunderstood what the real question was in that case. They thought the question was, has there been fraud in some of these states? That wasn't the question, that wasn't the legal question that was being asked. The legal question that was being asked was, can one sovereign state sue another sovereign state for that defendant state's exercise of its sovereign constitutional power? That was the real question
Right.
asked. And the answer to that question is no. You can't sue another state for its exercise of its internal sovereign power. If that wasn't the answer, then every other state could sue Idaho for what we do here.
Right.
And that undermines the constitutional principle of sovereignty, okay?
Yeah.
And it undermines the constitutional principle of federalism. Federalism is that we have a federal government and state governments, and that each state government is separate from all the other states. So if California is able to sue Idaho, or Illinois is able to sue Idaho for what we do here, we really don't have a federal system and we really don't have state sovereignty. But if I don't want California or Illinois or New York to sue Idaho, then Idaho can't sue those other states either.
Right.
And so that's why I chose not to join that lawsuit. I was condemned heavily for it. But all 9 members of the United States Supreme Court, including the 3 that were appointed by the former president, agreed and said, yes, you states do not have standing to sue another state over this constitutional principle as they exercise their constitutional authority. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, totally. And I think that's really courageous because I think youth can relate somewhat to peer pressure. And a lot of times it's really easy to cave in. So I think that's really courageous. And Attorney General Wasden, if you were given magical powers to do anything, what would you do?
I read this question, I was quite intrigued by it. And here's the reason why. I often say, you know, when I was elected Attorney General, no one gave me a magic wand.
Right.
Because if I had all the powers that people thought I had, I would be king.
Right.
You know, and so if I had magical powers, I guess the thing that I would do is I would wave my magic wand and I would have people actually understand how government works.
Right.
And I would have them be civil to one another. Because you and I may agree or we may disagree. And we can have a conversation which is totally civil. You may be totally rational and reasonable in what you think. and it may be totally opposed to what I think, and I may be totally rational and reasonable in what I think. That doesn't mean you're the enemy.
Right.
It just means we have a civil disagreement.
Right.
And we actually can find a way to work together.
Right.
And accomplish good things. And we can disagree about some things and we can agree about other things.
Right.
I told you about my friend Tom Miller, who was the Attorney General of Iowa, the longest serving Attorney General in U.S. history. Tom went to a big name law school. He's a big tall guy, smart as a whip. And he comes from a different political party from me.
Right.
He's probably my best friend or he is my best friend in the AG world. And we talk to each other all the time. We don't agree on everything, but I really respect when he speaks.
Right.
I may ultimately disagree, but I really respect what he has to say. And I would tell you, if you asked him the same question, he'd say the same thing about me, that he respects what it is I have to say. He may disagree with me, ultimately, but we're not disagreeable together.
Right.
That I learn from him, and my position may change based upon listening to what he has to say.
Right.
Because I have to accommodate the valid points that he makes. And I think that he would tell you the same thing of me.
Right.
So if I had a magic wand, I would bonk people on the head and I'd say, you now actually have an understanding about how government works.
Right.
And secondly, that you would be civil and talk to people.
Right. And I think that's very true. And I've seen times where arguments, disagreements about politics too can drive people apart. And I think that's very true. And what is your advice for teens and youth that aspire to pursue a career in law or maybe become a future attorney general?
A couple of things I'd say. Number one, school is critical.
Right.
And number two, be careful what you do on social media. That stuff will haunt you all your life.
Definitely.
Okay? The third thing I would say is talk to some people that are in the field of politics, in the field of law, and get their ideas. Because there's some things about law that are just pure drudgery. I'm not going to shade that. It's pure drudgery. But it's also a very rewarding responsibility. I've had experiences and served my community in ways I could never have done had I not been an attorney and not been attorney general. I think is critical.
Yeah.
You ask what youth can do,
Yeah.
that's what they can do.
Wow. It's very inspirational. Is there anything else you'd like to add, like maybe a final message for youth, maybe?
I just want to congratulate you, actually. This is pretty amazing that a young man of your age or tender years would see a need and then devise a solution to that need. Well done.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for agreeing to this interview as well. Thank you so much.